My seminary Old Testament professor, Sib Towner, called that passage the golden text of the Old Testament. In these few words, that last little bit of verse 8, are summed up the entirety of what it means to be the people of God. If you had to put the theology of the Old Testament on a bumper sticker, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God would probably be it. Now, the prophet Micah was most likely writing at a time when the nation of Israel was languishing under the oppression of a foreign rule. Forced to pay tribute to the Assyrians, Israel was paying the price for its wandering from the path that God had set for them. In the passage we read today, Micah speaks both sides of a dialogue between God and the people of Israel. So if it seems sort of confusing, that's why, because he's speaking both sides of a dialogue. Essentially, God is arguing that God has done great things for Israel, but they have responded with ingratitude and disobedience. Sometimes we forget all the good things that have been done for us and given to us, and that's the case here. So God sets out to remind the people what they've got. Now, if you've spent any amount of time in a Sunday school class or vacation Bible school growing up, you can probably list off some of the great things that God did for the Israelites. But in their actions, they seem to show either ignorance or indifference to generations of God's mighty acts of mercy. And so God, sounding a little exasperated, reminds them. First of Moses and Aaron and Miriam, whom God sent to lead the people out of a horrific life of slavery in Egypt. Then God reminds them of the time that God handled the prophet Balaam, who had been contracted by King Balak to prophesy against the Israelites as they traveled toward his country on their way to the promised land. King Balak had hired Balaam to bring a curse upon the Israelites, but God intervened, and Balaam instead brought forth blessings on the people. God then recounts how, much like Moses at the Red Sea, the waters of the river Jordan are parted for Joshua, and he and the people were led across the river Jordan from Shittim into the promised land at Gilgal. In all of these acts and more, God has acted mercifully to save the Israelites and to deliver them to the promised land. How can the Israelites persist in their disobedience? Convicted by these charges, Micah speaks the people's response, essentially admitting that a debt is owed, that tribute must be paid to God. And it's the nature of that payment that forms the center of Micah's prophecy. The people respond to God by asking, "With what shall I come before the Lord?" The question refers to the temple cultus, the ritual offerings of sacrifices that were thought to not only please God, but to appease his anger and to earn for the giver God's forgiveness and favor. The cultic sacrifice of animals had been an important part of the worship of God earlier in Israel's history. The priests had to not only be familiar with the liturgy of the temple, but practically had to be butchers to properly kill and dress the animals that were brought as offering sacrifices for God. As a side note, if that were still a requirement to be a minister, I'd probably be something else. Just saying. For every sin, there was a certain sacrifice. For every economic level, there was an appropriate number and type of animals to be burned on the altar of the Lord. Sometimes it was a bull or a dove. At other times, offerings of wine or wheat or oils were required. Here, the people are returning to those sacrificial traditions. Is this what God wants? Now, they say that every person has a price. Well, what's God's price? And so the speaker asks if the burnt offering of a calf would suffice to settle accounts with God. And if not a single calf, then how about 1,000 rams? Such a sum would have been steep, but not without precedent. The book of Chronicles reports that on one occasion, David sacrificed to God 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, and 1,000 lambs. And in 1 Kings, Solomon is said to have regularly offered 1,000 burnt offerings. If the sins of the people were great enough, might God require of them the slaughter of 1,000 rams or more? Would God be appeased by the gift of fine oils? Elsewhere in the Old Testament, oil is included as an offering to God, but in small quantities. Here, the speaker suggests an unimaginable quantity, an entire river of oil, or even more. Not just one river, but tens of thousands of rivers of oil. It's an absurd amount, and basically asks the question, would all the oil in the world make God happy? The suggested offerings escalate beyond imagination, but then the speaker crosses the threshold into the irrational, the truly unthinkable. What about a child? What about the firstborn? Should the people be prepared to sacrifice their only children to appease God, to earn God's favor, to restore themselves to right relationship with God? Now, child sacrifice was never allowed in Israel, even though we remember the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac earlier in the book of Genesis. God intervenes there before Abraham can follow through with the command, and Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his child is seen as proof of his righteousness before God. But in spite of that story, that cherished bit of Israel's heritage, God never commanded the people to offer their children as sacrifices, and even chastises people on the rare occasions when they do. Here, the bargaining for God's favor has gone to truly ridiculous heights as Micah speaks for the people who are searching for something to give that will make them right with God. How much does God demand? But Micah responds on God's behalf, saying simply this: He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what else does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? When I was a kid, shopping for my father at Christmas and on his birthday was a challenge, partly because I had no money. But the bigger challenge was because whenever I would go and ask him, Dad, what do you want for your birthday? He would always, without fail, say to me, oh, just good kids that behave themselves and do well in school. I was always frustrated by that because buying him a necktie or a new pair of socks would have been infinitely easier than giving him what he was asking for. See, that necktie would only cost me some money, but being well-behaved, doing well in school, well, that would cost me everything I had. That would take my whole self, which is what God is telling the people through the prophet Micah. Their stuff, their wealth, even in the incomprehensible amounts that are being thrown about here, even their children, would just be more things given to God, when what God really wanted from them was their whole selves given to and for each other. Which is why this is the golden text of the Old Testament. The golden rule, you may remember, says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This golden text teaches that we are to do unto God by doing kindness and justice to each other. When we hear the word justice, we tend to think of the law and of the court system. But at its heart, the concept of justice is about people getting what they have a right to. For Micah, justice is not just a concept, but an action. Justice is something we do. Old Testament scholar James Lindbergh writes that to do justice means to work for the establishment of equity for all, especially the powerless. Doing kindness means more than simply being nice to other people. The Hebrew word used here is hesed, which is often used to describe the steadfast love of God. When used to describe human relationships, it means love with a strong element of loyalty, such as that between a husband and a wife or between two friends. And the third of God's requirements is to walk humbly with God. Now, we often hear folks say, you can't just talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. And Christians especially speak often of walking with God. But I think that concept gets watered down when we take it to mean that we simply align ourselves with God. Since today is Super Bowl Sunday, I'll put it in football terms. Walking with God doesn't mean just putting on a replica team jersey and sitting in your well-appointed living room watching the game. It means getting out onto the field. And as my coach used to say, hit somebody. Walking with God means orienting one's life towards God's will, being led by God to do the things that God would have us do, and to go into the places where God would have us go. When we hear this call to walk with God, we should immediately remember Christ's call to the disciples to come and follow me. It's an invitation to deny the self, to not just be associated with God, but to do something for God. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote, "To deny oneself is to be aware only of Christ and not ourselves, to see only him who goes before and not the road which is too hard for us." You see, this passage in a way is a warning for those who have set a limit as to how far they're willing to go. And we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that giving an hour a week of our time is sufficient, or that writing a check once a week is sufficient, that spending a little time in prayer or a little time reading our Bibles is sufficient. But what Micah speaks to the people of Israel here is also true for us, that God is less interested in the things we do as acts of devotion or obeisance to God than God is interested in the things we do to and for each other. Let that rest on your brains for a minute. And that might actually be more difficult. Fred Craddock says that we think giving our all to the Lord is like taking a $1,000 bill and laying it on the table. Here's my life, Lord. I'm giving it all. But the reality for most of us is that God sends us back to the bank to cash that $1,000 for quarters. We go through life putting out 25 cents here and 50 cents there. Usually giving our life to Christ is done in all those little acts of love, 25 cents at a time. You see, when we give ourselves to God, when we make our commitments to follow Christ, I honestly believe that we are making a commitment to run through walls if that's what God asked us to do. That we intend to climb the tallest mountains, swim the widest seas, and give our lives to the glory of God if we have to. The winter storm that just hit down south last week paralyzed much of North Georgia, including the city of Atlanta. Because of the ice and snow, school buses were not able to get to all the schools to take children home at the end of the day. So a number of children and teachers had to spend the night at their schools. But one parent, Mark Nilsson, walked 6 miles through the snow and ice to reach his 5-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, who was a kindergartner at E. Rivers Elementary School, just to make sure that she was okay. 6 miles. At another school, teachers hiked through the snowy night to a nearby Kroger to fill emergency prescriptions for students who needed their seizure medications. See, when bad things happen, heroes always arise. And I bet that every one of you here would have done the same thing. In an emergency, we step up and make sacrifices. If God asked us to do something big, we would do it. When we think of people who gave their lives to God, we think of names like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr. and Mother Teresa. But the fact of the matter is, you will never be required to risk your life taking a stand against the Nazis like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or put yourself in jeopardy leading a movement for equality like Martin Luther King, or give your life serving the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta like Mother Teresa. But God does require that you do equity, that you love loyally, and that you daily go where God sends you and do what God calls you to do. Will that mean making life-altering sacrifices? Maybe, but probably not. But what it will require is that you spend 90 minutes 4 Sundays a year taking care of our children so that their parents can come to worship and be a part of this church. It will require you to teach Sunday school so that our children can learn the tenets of the faith that has carried us through these years. You'll probably never be asked to sell all that you own and give the money to the poor as a requirement to following Jesus. But you will be asked to pick up an extra bag of groceries when you go shopping to help those families who are struggling to make ends meet. And you will be asked to give up a Saturday afternoon to feed the hungry at Hogue Memorial, or a Sunday evening to feed families at the Y Family Shelter. You'll most likely never have to sacrifice something important to you in order to obey God's command to follow. But you will be asked to give of your time and attention to visit with someone who is sick or old and just can't get out much anymore. And you will be asked to speak up when people are being treated unfairly. And you will be asked to be inconvenienced for the sake of the kingdom. That's what it means to be the people of God. Not that we give so much to the glory of God, but that we glorify God by giving so much for the betterment and well-being of God's people. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God.